Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking about encounter design, but a little bit of a specific type. We're going to talk about the difference between encounter design for horror games and encounter design for adventure and action games. So what is the difference between designing an encounter for a horror game and an action game? Well, it's actually really simple. If we watch a lot of action films or we watch a lot of horror films, both of which are great like inspiration for how to do encounter design and like maybe do some storyline beats for your own game, we see that in action movies there's a lot of, like I guess minions, a lot of bad guys to go through. So we see this a lot when we run adventure games too. When we run games like D&D, or if we run Pathfinder or Star Wars, we always have that type of stormtrooper slash goblin slash town guard or just, sentry type NPC that is really just there to give a little bit of an action beat to a bit of the story and maybe provide a little bit of an obstacle for our players, right? Well, in horror games, unless you're running something like survival horror in the way of like maybe a zombie game like All Flesh Must Be Eaten or something along those lines, usually you're going to have more elite, smaller number of bad guys than you're going to have, in like say a normal adventure game. You're not going to have as many minions. You're not going to have as many like throwaway bad guys or just one or two turn dice rolling obstacles in the form of like minions or bad guys. So when we're designing encounters for these type of horror games, what we end up doing is we reduce the amount of NPC fodder, right? The amount of minions is drastically reduced, especially if you're doing like something akin to maybe a slasher or the Blood in the Bayou game that's now currently up on Storyteller's Vault. Sorry, shameless plug, had to do it. That's a game that is essentially two main bad guys with a tertiary like pseudo villain in the form of a ghoul against like a smaller party of individuals, normal people that have been captured, and they're in the Louisiana bayou. I briefly brought this game up I think once before. So anyways, in this type of game where it's like more of the big bad guy chasing the survivors or the small group of PCs, you may only have like one main bad guy, and in that case your encounters have to be a little more thoughtful in design, right? We can't just throw minions or small-time NPC baddies at the players because it kind of dilutes, the idea of one big bad dude essentially having them in a powerless situation. So it changes like a lot of the beats and a lot of the tone and the atmospherics of a horror game if you do a lot of minions versus just one main bad guy and start doing environmental obstacles. And like maybe mystery beats as well, or ways to ratchet up tension without actually having physical encounters. Because really, when you think about it, in a horror movie, you have a couple of encounters with the main slasher character. Usually it ends with people dying, but the main characters, the ones that survive, the protagonists, usually are your typical like final girl. Only meet them a handful of times throughout the story. A brief scuffle happens, and then either the bad guy gets incapacitated, and they falsely believe that he's dead or taken care of, only to come about later and pop into their faces again, or the heroes flee. So that leads you to kind of view through an encounter lens. The way that went down is that the NPC is just a lot more powerful than the PCs tend to think, or than they can handle at the time, which can lead to them fleeing. Now, the important part in doing encounter design for a horror game is that PCs have to understand, players have to understand that fleeing is an option. You can always run away, and that can sometimes allow them to survive an encounter that otherwise would just be dead for them. A lot of times though, players kind of have this weird belief that if I can't beat the encounter and we're like got a fraction of our health left, we just have to carry it through the end. Now, they need to learn that you can run, it's okay. So that may need a little bit of encouragement from the storyteller side, from your side, to say, hey guys, you guys can always try to run, he's not that fast. Or, maybe have it to where the NPC is an obstacle and is going to be delayed in chasing after them, to give them time to escape, to lick their wounds, to maybe re-equip themselves. Or on the flip side, an adventure game, usually those encounters before they get to the big boss fight, right, are going to be like with little minions that they can easily beat up. It maintains an action beat, it lets them feel accomplishment, and they just carry on to the next bad guy. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but in a horror game, that kind of takes away this idea of powerlessness that you kind of want to foster to create that tension around the table, right? You need to make that bad guy something that they're able to run away from, at least in those initial encounters, so they know, like, we got to take this guy seriously, or we need to get, is there anything around the house? Is there like a gun or a knife or something that we can use? Can we make a trap? You want to make them start thinking outside the box, or try to find ways to gear up for this encounter. So when you make these encounters with boss fights, essentially think of it like when you're doing a horror game, almost every encounter is with a boss or with the main bad guy they're trying to escape. Now, this is, again, for one type of horror game, right? So when there's only one main bad guy, if you're doing stuff like a bunch of zombies or a house of horrors or ghosts, there may be a couple of moderate-sized baddies there, but still, generally this rule still maintains itself. You don't want to have as many encounters. You want to have more meaningful encounters. They want to be more impactful to your party of players and characters. So that may mean that the bad guy's a little higher up in level, or a challenge rating, or experience in comparison to where the players are at. But that's just to make them think on their feet, right? Now, the biggest part about making these encounters for horror games is that they should feel hard, but not impossible. You always want to leave a sliver of hope, right? Because otherwise, we're just going to party wipe. Where are we going to bother playing? So these are all things to think about when you're making these encounters. And these are all very important things to go over as you're writing your notes for the adventure. Because if you're doing one big bag and chasing them, for example, through a house that is, decaying and rotten, and like an old school slasher film where it's a bunch of like normal people or low level PCs stuck in a house or a single location with one bad guy who's hunting them down. Examples of movies we see of this are things like Predator. It's one enemy hunting down the group. The first Alien and Alien 3, where it's one alien hunting down a bunch of people and the players have to try to find a way to survive. But in these movies like Alien and Predator and like the Michael Myers movies or the Freddy movies, Friday the 13th as well, those are things that, there's not really one bad guy. And if you look at those encounters, how those are structured, kind of do the same thing there. Obviously the characters are probably going to get injured, but allow them a chance to get away. Now, in horror movies, a lot of the times protagonists they die. They die, they die, they die. So unless you're trying to run a game that's super, super lethal, like say, for example, the Aliens RPG in cinematic mode, you really kind of want to maybe not just go for the kill, go for the incapacitation, go for the wounding, let other players gather the downed player's character and pull them back to safety and give them a little bit of reprieve so they can rearm themselves essentially, or rethink some strategies here. You don't really want to give them too much time. It's a horror game. Encounters in horror games should be spaced out as long as you need them to be spaced out to allow tension to either deflate a little bit or build back up. Because if you recall, when we talked about managing tension around the table in horror games, there's this idea of playing with the tension level of a game to make it more like adrenaline filled for the PCs that are there, the characters, with the little scares here and there, but also triumphs to kind of deflate that, or maybe humor to deflate even more, to kind of like play with that idea of rising and falling tension throughout the course of the game, much like you see in horror movies, yeah? It's not always tense all the time. You do have moments of humor, of comedy, of victory, and you want to reflect those moments that you see in film in your game around your table, and encounter spacing therefore needs to be more carefully thought about, right? In a normal adventure game, you can give them like a day's rest, or maybe they go to a shop and buy supplies before they go back out and they start initiating those combats. Now, one also big difference between a horror game and doing encounters for an adventure game is usually in an adventure game, the encounters are initiated by the characters, right? They're going out to beat up the bad guy, they're hunting down, the rampaging monster, whatever it is. They're the ones who are instigating, the conflict. In a horror game, take that power away from them. Have the bad guy initiate those chase scenes or those combats or the scuffles. If you take that power away from the characters, you kind of leave them on the defensive, which is kind of where you want them to be in encounters with a horror game, to be completely honest. The players should be reactive as opposed to proactive most of the time. Until that final confrontation, ideally, it should be reactive. The final confrontation comes in, they've either gotten the confidence or the gear or the skills or whatever it is to handle the monster that has been terrorizing them. That's when they should take that power back and become proactive for the encounter. So those are things to think about. Those are just some small ideas that you can use around the table and help to differentiate between running an adventure game and doing those encounters and running a horror game and creating those encounters. Anyways, I hope that all helped. As always, if you guys have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you want to get alerts to more content we got coming out. Now, since this is the last video for October, we're going to go back to our normal schedule of talking about just general, storytelling tips and game mastering tips. This month has all been about different tips that are more useful for horror games, but please, you can use any of the things we've talked about today in your normal games that don't have to be like a horror game or even a horror session. You can use ideas like reading tables and building and managing tension around normal adventure games and just add a little bit more, flavor to your table. But until next time, guys, have fun.